We're reading from EVERNIGHT, and tonight it is the 5th chapter, the Doomsday spell. In a far-off part of the palace, King August Nightingale, supreme ruler of the Silver Kingdom, sat in a grand desk in a grand room and wrote a message. The only sounds as he worked were the scratching of the nib on witch paper and the pop and crack of the fire. When the king was satisfied, he put down his pen. The chair creaked under his enormous weight as he leaned back and watched the witch paper arrange itself in a series of crisp folds until it became an angular paper bird. The paper bird hopped around the desk, spread its wings and circled the room as the king opened a tall window. The paper bird swooped through the open window and the king watched it flash out over the city. The door to the chamber opened and the king knew at once that Mrs. Hester had joined him. She was the only person brave enough to enter his rooms without knocking first. He turned to her. "I see you've sorted yourself out," he said. Mrs. Hester moved her jaw around as if trying to loosen something tight. "Yes, Your Majesty. Always takes a while to get used to my new skin. You sent for me?" The king nodded, and Mrs. Hester noted the troubled look in his eyes. "More white witches run away with the hags, Your Majesty?" The king's rage boiled over. He slammed the window shut, rattling the glass panes. "It's unacceptable!" "Those damn hags!" A flicker of rage lit up in her chest, but Mrs. Hester extinguished it, remained calm. The last thing she wanted to do was let the king know that her powers were weakening. There was a deep leather armchair by the fire and she sat down and ran a hand through her hair. It felt good to have a full head of hair again. "It's troubling, I admit." "Troubling? Your own people are turning against you, and that's all you can say?" Mrs. Hester pressed the tips of her fingers together. "What would you like me to say?" The king's face darkened. "I'd like you to tell me that it won't happen again." "If I said that, I'd be lying, Your Majesty. But I am working on something, and I'm close to finding a solution, I hope. True, the hags from Westerly Witch have helped a small number of our white witches escape, but what we must remember, I think, is that these cases are rare. Without souls, my white witches don't have it in them to allow for such concepts of love or freedom. So most of them don't want to escape, see? They are born into servitude, just as their parents and their parents' parents were. They serve you. It is part of them. But extracting a soul is a complicated business, Your Majesty, and perhaps I might have made mistakes over time, maybe left a little of the soul in the body. That's what's caused this desire to leave in a tiny handful of them, but I don't reckon it can be many." Did she really believe that, though? How long, she wondered, had she been losing her grip? How many mistakes? The Silver King scoffed. "What if there's an army of them all plotting and waiting for the hags to come along and help them escape?" "Every revolution begins with a whisper, Mrs. Hester. What if the whisper from your witches becomes a din we cannot silence?" "Your Majesty, this problem can and will be solved, but it will take some time." "Just get it done," said the king, bringing his fat fist down on the desk petulantly. He was 35 years old, still a relatively young man, and at times like this, when he was angered or troubled, he often resembled an overgrown toddler. He was spoiled and selfish and had no interest in his two young sons, who he'd sent away to live in a castle in the south with their mother, so he could concentrate on the things he cared about, like hunting and eating and drinking fine wine. His thick rubbery lips curled into a half sneer. "If I can't trust my white witches any more, Mrs. Hester, if they all run off and leave me, remind me exactly why I still need you." For a moment, Mrs. Hester's eyes flared wide. "How dare you?" she thought. "Hell's teeth. Without me, there might not even be a silver kingdom, at least not as great as it is today. And revolution? Don't talk to me about revolution, boy. I started my own revolution, and if things had worked out, if I had taken the throne in Westerly Witch all those hundreds of years ago, the world would be a very different place. I would not be answering to you for a start, you fat, slimy—" Mrs. Hester did not say any of this out loud, of course. She had seen many silver kings and queens come and go, and she had learnt how to play the game. So she bowed to the king, her false deference a little over the top, and said, "I hope soon, Your Majesty, to show you I can still be useful. Will there be anything else?" The Silver King grunted, sat back down, and began once again to write at his desk. Mrs. Hester made a face to the back of his head and left the chamber. 5 minutes later, she slammed the door of her own apartment with such force that the bottles on her shelves clinked and rattled. From one of these shelves, she carefully lifted an ancient clay urn, its markings worn away by the ravages of time. Mrs. Hester removed the lid, activating the ancient summoning spell binding Degeni to urn. An inky swirl of air appeared in the middle of the room, and then it was gone. Shadow Jack was standing before her. In his hand he held a knife. The blade was wet with fresh blood. Mrs. Hester looked at the blade and the blood and raised an eyebrow. "Did I interrupt something?" "It can wait, mistress," Shadow Jack said, stowing the knife away. "You have a new face." "I do. It looks upset." "No, it's just impatient." She narrowed her eyes. "How long until the spell is ours? You promised. We were very close. More white witches have escaped and the king is losing patience. I need to squash those hags once and for all." "Only a day or two. Jenny Winter is dead. The coven is no more. So what are we waiting for? Where is the spell?" "There was a slight problem. The Doomsday spell is in the sewer, but fear not. I've already searched many of the tunnels, so I'm closing in. It will soon be yours." "And if someone else finds it before you do?" "The only people down there are the Toshas and bandits. If one of them finds the spell, they won't have a clue what it is. They'll try and sell it. I have every merchant and shopkeeper in the city on the lookout. Either way, it's imminent." Mrs. Hester worried her bottom lip. The small dappling of freckles on her smooth forehead knitted. "I can almost taste it. I'm so close." Shadow Jack's head dropped to one side. "Are you sure you want to do this, mistress? You seem a little anxious." Mrs. Hester glared. "I'm about to set everlasting darkness loose on the world, and the only thing that can control it again is a spell, which you have promised to find me, but failed to deliver. So it's you who should be anxious, because if you don't find me that spell, it'll be back in the urn for you. Or have you forgotten who is in charge here?" "No, mistress." "Good. Those hags in Westerly Witch have made a fool of me for long enough. I want them gone, and I want that mother tree all to myself. She stroked her hair. Show me again. Shadow Jack rolled his eyes. This all seemed so small. He was a genie, made by ancient gods, forged in fire and shadow during a war that had left the universe a smoking ruin. It was a war between two factions of gods, light and dark, and their armies were conjured from dust and flame and rock. Shadow Jack had been on the side of the goddess Lady Light, but the war had been long, and he'd wanted it to end, and so he had betrayed his mistress and gone to the darkness. When the war was over, Shadow Jack had found himself on the losing side, and when the gods had gone on to different realities, Shadow Jack had been left behind in an urn as punishment for his great betrayal. He was as old as this world, and there were only two things in it as ancient as he. One was the great mother tree of Westerly Witch. It was said that when the last of the gods, Mother Earth, left this reality, her tears had formed the oceans, and from the water sprouted the mother tree, whose enchanted blossom charged the air, the source of all magic. And the other, a living weapon left over from the war of the gods, a hateful, hungry darkness. With a snap of Shadow Jack's fingers, Mrs. Hester's chambers melted away, and the two conspirators stood inside a vision that seemed very real on the banks of a great black lake under a dark sky ablaze with stars. In the middle of the lake stood a small island of jutting rock. Mrs. Hester stared over it, looked down at her hands, and saw that she was trembling. It was in there, in that island, a darkness as old as Shadow Jack. She could feel it bubbling and writhing under the earth, trapped, starving, angry. The EVERNIGHT. Another of Shadow Jack's finger snaps, and they were back in the reality of Mrs. Hester's lamplit rooms. "Get after that spell," she told him, clasping her hands to try to hide the shaking. "I've waited long enough." Without hesitation, Shadow Jack became an enormous raven and flew out of the opened window. Mrs. Hester watched him disappear over the city. Her eyes turned to the west, and she thought of the mother tree and the city of Westerly Witch that she had once called home. She remembered clearly the great blossom blooming every spring on the mountain-sized tree, its glowing flowers breathing magic into the world, the sweet smell as honey and the sound of crystalline and music. And it would all soon be hers. With the help of the EVERNIGHT, she would wipe the hags away like a stain. After that, she'd ride to the rescue, banish the darkness, and be hailed a saviour. Every flower of the blossom, every petal, every crystalline whisper of pure magic would belong to her, and all she needed to complete her plan was an ancient spell hiding in the workings of a clockwork bird. The Doomsday spell.